Now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker this morning, our own Tricia Edgar. Edgar is an outdoor educator with 18 years of experience playing outdoors with children. She has a background in ecology, permaculture, restoration, and curriculum development. And she's one of the founders of Fresh Air Learning, a society that brings all seasons outdoor education to young children in the Vancouver area. Tricia is also a writer who focuses on green parenting and nature play. And she also writes on topics such as science, health, and gardening. Tricia, who has been coming to us for 9 years, lives in North Van with her partner Chris and her daughter Lauren, who's sitting there beside her. Please come up, Tricia. We're looking forward to hearing you.
And you'll see I was debating dressing completely formally today, and I too decided to do some Oz crossover. So it's sort of like the mullet, business on top and Oz on the bottom. When I was asked to do this in the month of joy, I kind of debated, does this topic actually fit? And I think that joy and despair are really not even two sides of the same coin, but two parts of the same yin and yang. They're really, really closely connected, and I feel that this does work in. So this is a sermon that I wrote about 1.5 years ago, and I've changed it a little bit since then, because since then I've had the pleasure of attending one of Joanna Macy's workshops with Lauren last year. So thank you for inviting me today. So a few years ago, Lauren and I went for a walk in the forest near our house, and it was close to evening, and it was just dusk. And we sat there on an old water pipe near our house, and we sat there with warm milk, and we looked up into the trees, and we were looking for bats. And that's what we like to do every spring and every summer. We like to go, we like to sit there just where our townhouse complex meets the forest and look up into the sky for the bats as it starts to become dusk. But that year, we couldn't find them. They weren't there. So I thought, well, it's just this one night. So the next night we came back. And the next night I came back again, and I came back again, and they weren't there. And this set me onto one of those worrying tangents that you get on, and then of course I went on the internet, which is always a bad thing to do when you're worrying. And I learned about bat colony collapse disorder, and I started to wonder, is this what's happening with our bats? And I read articles about the loss of biodiversity, and I moved deeply into the literature on climate change, and everything started to spiral, and I started to move into complete despair. And in the world inside my head, I thought about the destruction of species that I love, and I thought about the destruction of species that I don't know that I love because I don't know that they exist. And I thought about what might happen, what lay in store for my daughter and for the children that I work with, and about what would happen to me, what would happen to the people who are suffering now, who will suffer the effects of climate change and loss of biodiversity and habitat before we feel them so intensely. And then I'd go and I'd pick up my daughter from school and I'd make dinner, and I wouldn't talk about it, because when you're in the throes of existential despair, it's not really something you talk about at school pickup time. It's not a conversation you start to slide into very easily. So once again, I turned to Grandmother Internet, and I asked her, what do you do with existential despair? And I found the work of Joanna Macy, and I found her work, which she's called, for many years she's called Despair and Empowerment Work, and I found her most recent book called Active Hope. And I'll tell you a little bit about Joanna Macy. She's been a teacher for many years. This year will be her 86th birthday. She's a wonderful woman. When I got the chance to meet her, she's one of those idols who you meet and you come back even more impressed than when you started. She comes from a background of environmental activism, particularly anti-nuclear activism, and she's also a Buddhist who has a doctorate in systems theory. She has a unique perspective and a very simple message, and for many years she's worked to help people understand that in order to find our direction in the world in these times, we need to connect or reconnect to the world around us, even if that means feeling the pain that is the pain in the world. Her work is called The Work That Reconnects, or Despair and Empowerment Work. And it really struck a chord with me, in part because I realized that I had been practicing this for many years already. You see, shortly before, about 2 months before, actually my 10th anniversary was last weekend during the play, I was diagnosed with a chronic health condition just before my daughter was born. And this condition is type 1 diabetes, and it means that because I have an autoimmune disorder, my pancreas does not work, and that I need insulin to survive. So in the midst of the haze that surrounds those who've just had a baby, I turned at that point to researching, and I read about the complications of diabetes, and I read about comas, and I read about blindness, and I read about kidney failure. And it was not really what you want to read about when you have your newborn baby in your arms. And every time I wasn't perfect in managing my disease, I grieved and I thought about that list of things that I had read about, and then I would stop and I would readjust and I would move forward and I would learn how to do things just a little bit better. And so I've done that now for 10 years, and every day I fail, because diabetes is like that. You fail every day, you fail every hour. And every time you get up and you dust yourself off and you move forward again. And I feel that chronic illness is an excellent training ground for grief and for hope. And it's also a good window on the way that our society responds to grief. People aren't very comfortable, and many of you have probably experienced this with your own grief in your own lives. People aren't comfortable with your grief. While the people who were close to me, they grieved because they knew that I had a chronic illness, other ones put on a cheerful face, and over at the beginning I heard, "Oh, don't worry, in a few years you'll be cured." And I felt like it was just so tempting for people to deny things that make you profoundly sad. And I think that's why we often frame illness as something that people battle and conquer. And we tell people that they'll be cured, as if that can cure them. And then we can move on, and then we can move away from those feelings of grief and loss and despair that would come if we really sat with that other person's grief for a while. So I want to get back to Joanna Macy, and I want to relate this to our pain for the world, so that existential despair. Because even though we don't want to acknowledge the pain in the world, the pain still exists. And according to Joanna Macy, it's that pain that we need to acknowledge and we need to feel. And we need to use to move forward in our lives and in our work, in our joyful work of transforming society. One of her most recent books is called Active Hope. And she says for a long time, she tried not to use the word hope. She didn't like it. But now she sees hope, as in the opening words, as a compass direction, rather than ignorant optimism. And she says that active hope is a process, and it has several parts. So I'll go over those with you now. Active hope begins with joy. So it begins with seeing the wonder in the world around us. And this gratitude that you have for the beauty of the world gives you nourishment for what is to come. Then she moves on to the challenges in the world. She asks you to feel what gives you pain and to grieve if you wish to do so. You might have lost a place that's deeply meaningful to you, or you might realize that plants or animals or people that you love are dying, and that makes you very sad. And she says it's all right to feel sad about these things. And in her workshop, she gives people a place to feel sad about them and to feel very openly sad. After grief, you may feel a desire to change or to act. And in this desire, Joanna Macy sees two particular strains of action. One of them she calls holding actions, and those are ones that probably many of us have done in our lives. These actions include things such as protesting against an oil pipeline. They're actions that defend what's important to you and defend what exists today, and they're preventing further damage. But she points out that defending isn't enough. What exists now is still very broken in many ways, and we won't win all of the fights that we undertake. We also need to move forward into the next phase of action, which is creating the society that we want to see in the world. She talks about the concept of the Great Turning, which is a concept that David Corton outlined in his book of the same name. In his book, he traces the many, many organizations in the world that are doing wonderful work, inspiring work. And he talks about how this work is often invisible, because there's no one who oversees this global change. It comes from all directions. It can occur when people gather food for a food bank, or when a business changes waste and turns it into a resource. It could be an outdoor program for children, or something that helps people save water. Macy's active hope encourages us to hold to the actions that protect what we love, but it also pushes us to become co-creators of a new, abundant culture, a culture that regenerates the earth instead of damaging it. And I find that her views connect nicely with another passion of mine, permaculture, which is a design method that is based on the idea that human creativity can turn problems into abundance, and that instead of being a blight on the planet, as many environmental movements have told us that we are, people can become a restorative force, healing and generating abundance. In permaculture and in Macy's Great Turning, people are the planet's way of becoming conscious of itself. And it is the challenge of our time, she says, to bring this consciousness to fruition and to become beings who understand that our role is to work with the rest of the earth and to enrich it. Now, before I go on as to how do you do this great transformational change, I wanted to incorporate a little bit more of Wendell Berry, because I love him so much. And to me, this poem of Wendell Berry's really encapsulates the Great Turning. And it's a part of the poem called Work Song. Some of you might know it already. I'll try not to cry. This one always makes me cry. If we will have the wisdom to survive, to stand like slow-growing trees on a ruined place, renewing and enriching it, then a long time after we are dead, the lives that our lives prepare will live here, their houses strongly placed upon the valley sides. The river will run clear as we will never know it, and on the steps where greed and ignorance cut down the old forest, an old forest will stand, its rich leaf fall drifting on its roots. The veins of forgotten springs will have opened, and families will be singing in the fields, and memory, native to this valley, will spread over it like a grove. And memory will grow into legend, and legend into song, and song into sacrament. And the abundance of this place, the songs of its people and its birds, will be health and wisdom and indwelling light. This is no paradisal dream, its hardship is its reality. So, where do we go from here? How do we become part of this great turning? I think it is happening. And to borrow Macy's metaphor from our first reading, I try to turn my own personal compass in the right direction. I try to build what I'd like to see in the world, rather than only reacting against the terrible things that are happening in it. But there are so many barriers to undertaking this work. The first one is the one that I explored earlier. It's our cultural predisposition to avoid grief. The second one, I think, also plays into that desire. In our modern world, our perception of time makes us feel like we have no space to fit in the life-changing world of cultural transformation. After all, we need to pick up our children from school, we need to pay the bills. And as I wrote this sermon a year and a half ago, I kept a second file open on my computer, so I could take all the clutter of my brain and put it in that file. It was a list of what I had to do that day. Get cat food, organize a farewell party. And in this busy world, and in our busy lives, there's a risk that we will use busy to keep away our thoughts of despair. Macy talks about how the speed of our lives gives us permission to push grief away. She says, people of today relate to time in a way that is surely unique in our history. The technologies and the economic forces unleashed by the industrial growth society, which is our society now, radically alter our experience of time. It is like being trapped in an ever-shrinking box in which we race on a treadmill. The economy and its technologies depend on decisions made at lightning speed for short-term goals, cutting us off from nature's rhythms and from the past and from the future as well. Marooned in the present, we are blinded to the sheer ongoingness of time. Both the company of our ancestors and the claims of our descendants become less and less real to us. Even as we see its consequences, we must remember that this relation to time is not innate in us. As humans, we have the capacity and the birthright to experience time in a saner fashion, she says. Throughout history, men and women have labored at personal cost to bequeath to future generations monuments of art and learning that will endure far beyond their lives, and they have honored through ritual and story those who came before. Macy says that to make a transition to a life-sustaining society, we must retrieve that ancestral capacity. We need to act like ancestors. We need to place ourselves in tune with longer ecological rhythms and nourish a felt connection with past and future generations. For us, the agents of change, this isn't easy because to intervene in the political and legislative decisions of this society, we fall into its tempo and we race and race to find and pull the levers before it is too late to save the forest, before it is too late to stop that weapons program. But, she says, we can learn to drink at deeper wells. Thirdly, I think that many of us might consider the transformative changes that we'd like to make in the world if we had some time to think. But the vastness of our global economy and our global society makes us feel very, very small. Over and over again, and this is 20 years as a human rights activist as well as someone in the environmental movement, I've heard so many times that the things people are fighting for are so very large. And I don't feel this very often myself because I tend to be an incurable optimist in that regard, but I feel it when it comes to climate change. My own habits, such as my plan to avoid flying, seem very small when compared to the thousands of packed flights that leave every day, and I wonder how I can make a difference. At a workshop on Active Hope, I listened to Macy's co-author, Chris Johnston, talk about the photos in a newspaper. When you skim through the paper, you see photos of what's going on in the world, and each photo is made out of hundreds of smaller parts that you can't see unless you look with a magnifying glass. And they're called pixels. And they are small, almost invisible parts of a greater whole. And he pointed out that we are all pixels in this world of billions. Each one of us is responsible for our own pixel. And with it, we may make some small changes in the pixels around us as well. To quote Edward Everett Hale, I am only one, but I am one, and I cannot do everything, but I can do something, and I will not let what I cannot do interfere with what I can do. And then there is uncertainty. What if we fail? What if all the bad things in the world happen, and any of the good things, whatever they are for you, are engulfed by this catastrophe? Thinking about massive global issues like climate change, you get the sense of being swept away. Maybe there's a current underneath that will rise and move your ship away from the shore, but maybe it won't. But creating transformation is not about the odds. It is about what you hope for and how you go about creating your vision, and it's about pointing in the right direction and moving forward boldly. Uncertainty reminds us to be grateful for what is good and what is beautiful. It also brings me back to reflect on Macy's thoughts about time. She is a scholar of deep time, and reading her work on time, I am reminded that everything that surrounds us is ephemeral. All of these people, these buildings, these ecosystems, these inventions, this destruction, this amazement is the smallest blip in the history of our world. It reminds me that we are very small, but that if we choose, we can be part of a great shift in consciousness and action that will last beyond our own lives and those of our children. In her book, Coming Back to Life, Macy has one exercise that very much struck me, because I have a child who is around the same age as the one in her exercise. and she calls it 30 Years Hence. In her exercise, she asks the reader to imagine that 30 years from now, everything terrible in the world has been resolved. There is no hunger, there is no war, there is no rapidly changing climate. You wake up one morning in this world, and walking toward you, you see a child of about 10 years old. And this child walks tentatively towards you, and then she moves confidently, and as she reaches you, she introduces herself. And she says that she and her friends are doing a project, and they have some questions for you. She asks you about the time before, the time right now, and she asks you about your struggles that you faced. She asks you, what did you do to face these challenges, and how did you manage to persevere? The two of you talk for a time, and then she rises and she looks at you. She says goodbye, and then she starts to walk away. And then she turns and she looks at you again, and she says, thank you. And to me, meeting pain with joy and transformation is the way to approach the challenges of the world. And this is active hope. And my addendum is that the year after we went to that place in the forest, and we waited for the bats, and they didn't come. The next year we went in the forest again, and we sat down on the log, and we waited for the sun to go down. And when it did, a little bat flew through the trees. Thank you.